Hi friends, you're listening to the Shattered Ceilings podcast with your hosts Stephanie and Adriana. We're here to discuss the importance of mental health from the perspective of two first-generation immigrants. Join in weekly as we dive into important topics such as relationships, parenting, and cultural barriers. Here, we get real and candid as we explore what disrupting the status quo looks like for each of us.
Hey guys, welcome back to Shattered Ceilings podcast. We are your hosts, Stephanie
And Adriana.
And we're so glad to have you guys back today. Thank you for joining us on another episode. We appreciate all the feedback we've gotten. We're seeing the messages, the comments, and we're just so appreciative. And please keep joining us every week and keep giving us feedback on the episodes. So today we are talking about an extremely important subject that is, I think, so relevant. It is about the importance of setting up healthy boundaries in our lives. So if you just got a cold sweat as soon as I mentioned that, I completely understand. Setting boundaries can be like a really difficult task. And even the thought of having to do that with loved ones can be super scary. Some questions you might have in your mind are like, what if the other person doesn't react well? What if they don't respect my boundaries? And I think these questions are exactly why we need to have this discussion today, so that we can all together learn just how important it is to establish healthy boundaries. Both Adriana and I read the book Boundaries by Henry Cloud in preparation for this episode, and I love so much the analogy that he uses when he says that just like a homeowner puts up a fence around their property, we also need to put up mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual boundaries in our lives. Because not establishing boundaries can have so many negative effects on us, such as it holds us back from reaching our full potential. It can prevent us from being able to establish healthy relationships, and it also prevents us from learning the importance of self-care.
Yeah, a lot of psychological symptoms such as depression, anxiety, eating disorders, addiction can result from being conflicted about boundaries. Not being able to set up boundaries can stem from issues that a lot of us deal with, such as low self-esteem, seeking approval from others, or the fear of being rejected, which leads us to say yes to everything. Yeah. A huge problem for Christians today is they struggle with confusion and guilt about when and how and with who they should set limits with. Yeah. Boundaries is the best form of self-care.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah. I read the book. It's actually been like 4 years now. I read it when I was in therapy. My therapist is like, if you could read one book that would benefit you, it's this book. And when I got it, I was like, there's so many people in my life that's been like recommending it. So if you're listening and someone's recommended this book,
read it.
Do yourself a favor. You can only, read it. You'll learn from it, and you can always give it away too. So I think my main takeaway that I got from the book was learning how to say no, and it's not selfish to say no. It's actually, like I said, a form of self-care. So I know a lot of questions that you're probably thinking that we hope to answer today can be, can I set limits and still be a loving person? What if someone is upset by my boundaries? Why do I feel guilty when I consider setting boundaries, and aren't boundaries selfish?
Yeah. So I think as women, and especially as Christian women, it can be so hard for us to understand boundaries. And I say women because a lot of times we're more emotional than men. And I think that if we don't fully grasp or understand the concept of healthy boundaries, we can tend to think of boundaries and kindness as not being synonymous. For example, in our minds, we think of boundaries, I think, as being walls that we put up to shut others out. But just like it says in the book, I think that boundaries should actually be permeable. We need to think of boundaries as doors, letting in good things and keeping bad things out. An example that they use in the book is you wouldn't let a thief into your house to steal your things, or your kids.
Yeah, there you go.
But you might let in a friend who you trust. Boundaries are just us choosing who we allow to come into our house and how far we allow them to come into the house. Going back to us not thinking of boundaries as kind, I just want to bring this up. In some relationships, if you don't establish boundaries with a certain person, you actually are being unkind because you might be, for example, enabling them. One example I can think of is if out of guilt you decide to help an alcoholic family member financially, then you can be hindering them from pursuing their recovery, which is actually unkind. So that concept and that term of boundaries not being kind just cancels itself out. Again, I love what Henry Cloud alludes to in the book when he says that having no boundaries can cause us to take on problems that God never intended for us to take on.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Yeah.
Yeah, boundaries can also help us distinguish what is and what isn't our responsibility and take that guilt off of our shoulders that a lot of us feel and experience.
Yeah.
I know when I first read the book, I think it was like the first chapter, it talked about a girl who was like, who had a house and she was taking care of her lawn, and she went outside to like water her lawn and take the weeds out. And she was looking at her neighbor's lawn and it kind of looked a little rough. And she's like, oh, let me just help since I'm already out here anyways. And so like slowly, every time she went outside, she would help the neighbor's lawn. And the neighbor started realizing like, oh, someone's taking care of my lawn. Like, cool, you know, I'll just take advantage of that. And then eventually the owner of the house was taking care of the neighbor's lawn so much that she looked over and her lawn was like a complete mess.
That's so...
And that like resonated with me because it's like, okay, you need to take care of yourself before helping others. And you might have like a good intention in helping others, but you really do need to put yourself first. That way you have energy to like help other people.
That's so, so true and so good.
Yeah, so I think establishing boundaries in our relationships allow us to have the freedom in relationships and not feel like we have to walk on eggshells.
Yeah.
I think that we are able to thrive in our life and in our relationships when we operate with healthy limitations.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I also like a lot what Lisa Turker says when she discusses boundaries. She thinks of two words when discussing boundaries, and those two words are access and responsibility. She mentioned how she realized that in her own life, personally, she was giving certain people level 10 access to like herself and her capacity and time, but those people were only demonstrating back level 3 responsibility. And I think that's where a lot of like dysfunction and chaos can happen in a relationship, and then we get frustrated because we're giving something, but like we're not getting back from the other person. But really, that's when it comes down to that, it is our job to communicate with the people in our lives what responsibility level we expect from them based on what level of access we're giving them. And if they can't rise to that level of responsibility, then we need to just lower our level of access in the relationship. Because we as human beings, we're all limited in our abilities and capacity. I know sometimes we think we're superhuman and we can do it all, but it's just not true. Sometimes we try to give people like our maximum time and effort in our relationships, but that sometimes can very quickly lead to burnout because you can't, if people can't rise to a certain level of accountability in a relationship, then we need to know that we should be putting like a boundary on ourselves in order to prevent like ourselves burning out. I think that having healthy boundaries teaches people how to respect us. And then like one quote I kind of want to bring up because I think about that it has to do with this is that when people show you who they are, believe them the first time. Yeah. I think that like in our relationships, we sometimes people prove to us or they do or say something that, you know, is hurtful or toxic. And then we either look over it or just sweep it under the rug and continue giving them that same level of access. Yeah. And then we're like shocked that in the end they like burn us, but really they were showing us who they were.
All the signs the whole time.
The whole time. So that's really true. Like if people show you who they are, like truly accept that and, you know, don't wish bad on that person, wish them well, but just know like, hey, you're not going to get that same level of myself in our relationship.
Yeah, you got to protect yourself.
Yeah.
Another thing is we are actually responsible on teaching other people on how they should be treating us. We teach them how to treat you by what we're allowing in our life, what we're reinforcing, and what we're stopping. So a lot of people have different boundaries. I don't know what your boundaries are until I do something, and then you tell me. So it's like we can look around and we see all these like physical signs like stop and like be careful. But when it comes to like our spiritual and mental boundaries, I don't know until it happens or until I ask you.
That's so true.
So I think this also has to do with the analogy of time as a currency. That's how a lot of people tend to think of time as currency. So like just how we would, for example, protect our bank accounts by setting up a boundary and having a passcode. We also need to be able to set up those boundaries so that we can protect our time that is so limited and not give every single person the same level of access to our time and emotions. I also think it's important to mention what the purpose of boundaries are before we dive into how to establish them. When we establish boundaries, we are not trying to control others. We are setting them up to protect ourselves and to ensure that we have self-control in all our relationships.
Yeah.
So how can we begin setting boundaries in a healthy and kind way with others in our life?
So I really think you just hit the nail on the head regarding the true purpose of boundaries. We need to understand that we can't and we should not set boundaries with the intention of controlling others. We shouldn't try to use boundaries as weapons, like to threaten people in our relationships, but we should think of them as safety measures. And that really comes back to just intent. What are your intentions in setting the boundaries in that relationship? Do you want to better the relationship? If it's for a toxic reason, then you're not setting boundaries for the right reason. I think that establishing boundaries really begins with being honest and transparent, like in all of your relationships. I know this has helped me so much, like in my adult life, is just being honest and communicating, like in every relationship. And I think that that scares like a lot of people because we think, oh, we don't want to hurt the other person's feelings. But like if you don't establish a boundary with the person, you run the risk of like down the line in the relationship, you might like explode emotionally, for example, when you're burnt out by the relationship, which will anyways hurt the person in the end. So is it not just like easier and more kind to just prevent that by being honest from the start about your emotional capacity? I think that that's just really important, is being clear in your intentions and like being clear with the other person in the relationship on what you can and can't handle. Secondly, I also think that boundaries looks like us learning to say no when you know that like you don't have the emotional or the physical capacity to fulfill that request. I think that's where self-awareness comes in, and us being like in tune with ourselves emotionally and knowing what our capacity is. And then, for example, like it's important to be kind but firm. So if somebody like wants something for you or is asking you something in a relationship, you can just say like, hey, I really appreciate you thinking of me, but I just don't have like the capacity to be able to fulfill that obligation right now.
Yeah, that's a nice way of putting it.
Yeah.
Saying no to people doesn't have to be like mean and confrontational. You're just explaining why you're saying no, or just, you also don't need to explain yourself when you say no.
That's a good point.
I also had to learn that.
Yeah.
You can be more vague, and if they ask and you don't want to tell them, you don't have to give them access to that. Another thing is if you don't know how to use your words, or if someone is really like hurting you or gaslighting you, and instead of saying something and they like are overstepping your boundaries, you can physically just like get up and leave. Which like sounds awkward. I've like done it a few times and it's very uncomfortable. But it actually made me feel better because I left a space I didn't feel good in. And then, I mean, who knows? I don't have control of the other person, but I'm sure they were like, oh my gosh, they just got up and left. Did I do something wrong? Did I hurt them? And it kind of makes them realize I can't talk this way to her because she's not going to deal with it. So again, very like hard to practice. It took me definitely a while, and I'm still learning on how to create those boundaries, but you're teaching them like, hey, I don't tolerate this and I'm going to leave.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So another thing I was thinking about, which is pretty cool, is God himself is the creator of boundaries. During creation, when he gave Adam and Eve one rule to not eat from the tree of knowledge. And Jesus also showed us many times what it means to have healthy boundaries by knowing his limits, saying no to inappropriate behavior, and being honest and direct. His number one goal was to always please God before pleasing people.
Yeah, I love that.
And yeah, like we talked about, a lot of us first generation immigrants deal with the toxic trait of people pleasing. And that inhibits us from creating those healthy boundaries when needed.
So I think those are such good points you brought up, and I think that's really what it comes down to in the end, is being comfortable like with our decisions and with the boundaries we set, because we should always be operating from that mindset of we shouldn't be living to please others. Especially as Christians, we should be living to please God, and if something is in alignment with his word and we have good intentions behind setting those boundaries, we need to be confident in that. And that's kind of what leads us into our last point, which is what to do when people get angry with your boundaries. I think that is like what prevents a lot of us maybe from setting boundaries in the first place. As we said before, we're not responsible for other people's feelings and actions, only for ourselves. And I think that can be hard to understand, maybe even like growing up And like with our parents, maybe sometimes you felt like guilty if, you know, they were having a bad or an off day or something, and that can lead you into that mentality of like, okay, people pleasing, I'm responsible to like make the other person happy. And we need to realize like now as adults, like it's not our responsibility.
Yeah.
And I know like we need to realize that we're only responsible for our own feelings and actions. And if you know that by saying yes to something or doing something that will make you uncomfortable and will lead you to like not act correct in a relationship, then it's our job and our responsibility to communicate that clearly with the other person. And if they get upset, then that's on them. And not only that, it reflects their own character and their own intentions. Just like you said, communicating with the other person, like, or even getting up.
Yeah.
I think that we live in a society where we are trying to like appease everybody and we have to be politically correct. So, but then that also like just perpetuates a lot of toxicity, because if somebody is like doing something that's harmful or wrong or toxic in a relationship, they need to know that's wrong. And that's like you said, like setting that boundary of getting up and leaving. And another example that I'm thinking of is like Lisa TerKeurst talks about, if you know that like a holiday or like an event is coming up and you have your family coming over, and like you have, for example, an uncle that always at the dinner table like brings up like topics that cause arguments. And I think
we
like
all have one.
yeah, literally. If you know that that's gonna happen and like you're gonna get upset and maybe explode on him in front of the family, then like setting a healthy boundary would look like you talking to your uncle and being like, hey, I really appreciate you being here, like you're always the life of the party, but I just want you to know, like if you bring up any topics that like might cause disagreements, like I'm just gonna get up and leave. So like you're not setting a boundary on him for him not to talk about things, but you're setting that boundary and that line that if you talk about this is what's gonna happen, I'm gonna get up.
Like you have a consequence for your actions.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that that's just really important. And one thing we need to like realize is that we do not need to feel guilty for like the actions and emotions of other people, because it's not our responsibility. That's on them, how they react. And if that person truly wants to be in your life, then they're going to respect you and your healthy boundaries. Because at the end of the day, healthy people respect healthy boundaries.
Yeah. And if they don't respect it, they're out.
Yeah.
Easy as that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Another thing I realized, like boundaries are not inherited. It's something we need to learn.
Yes.
And no one's going to teach you until you kind of go through life and you realize like, okay, I need to put a stop to this because it's not working out for me.
Yeah.
So something when you said like the whole guilt thing, I feel like that sparked something in me, because I feel like, again, earlier, I always said yes to everyone. Like everyone just knew like, oh, ask Adriana, she'll do it.
Yeah.
And for me, I was like, yeah, I love helping. Like that was my intention, is like for good. And that goes with like people pleasing, just wanting to make sure everyone's happy. And then after a while, when you say yes to everyone, and then you have to say no to yourself, and then I would have to like switch my whole schedule around, and then I'm stressed because I still have to do things for me, and I just didn't have time. The only person that was like, I guess, getting the negative end was me. Everyone else around me was thriving because I was doing everything for them.
Yeah.
And then at the end of the day, I would be like, oh my gosh, I still didn't do this and this and this. And I just didn't prioritize myself. So I kind of mentioned, you put yourself first, you do what you need to do, and then you can say yes to people and no to people. And that sounds way harder than it is.
Yeah.
I remember having to say no to people in the beginning, and it was like so uncomfortable.
Those
and
first
awkward.
couple times.
Yeah, especially when it's family and friends, where then they like kind of get caught off guard and they're like, wait, what do you mean you always say yes? And like I said, you don't owe them an explanation, but it was tough when I would say no. And this was even like before I was married. My parents would ask something of me or my siblings, and like, oh, do this today. And I was like, oh, I actually can't. And they like would stop and they're like, you don't have kids, you don't have a husband, like what else are you doing today? And I'm like, I have a life. Like just because I'm not married with kids doesn't mean my time is not as valuable as yours. Like we might have different schedules, but you can't just like assume this of me. So it was tough, and not feeling guilty, saying no. But after a while, it is more of like a freedom thing. And then they learn like, oh, Adriana's not always available. I'll ask if she can do it. If not, I'm not going to rely on her all the time.
Yes, they learn, so, like you said.
Yeah, they learn, and they won't learn until you do say no or put those boundaries up. So it is very uncomfortable. I had to learn.
Yeah.
Again, still kind of learning. But now when I see it, I'll look at my friends and I'm like, stop saying yes all the time. Or like someone's venting like, I have to do this and this and this. And I'm like, why'd you say yes to
Yeah,
all
it's
that?
not that
If you-
person's fault. It's yours. Yeah.
And I know it's hard until you start saying no, but I'm like, you need to stop putting all that responsibility on you.
Right.
If it's not yours in the first like
Yeah.
place.
And I think also like you enable the other person like to have bad behavior. Like it's kind of like with kids.
Kind of
like
funny.
Yeah, like that this is the line like with kids, like kids need discipline and they crave that even if they don't realize it, but subconsciously they do.
Need
and
it.
yeah, and you need to put that line and that boundary for the kid. Like if you don't, they're just going to walk all over you, and that's not fair to you or to them.
Yeah.
And then like you said, like if you get frustrated, like well, it's not the other person's fault, it's your own fault for not setting up that line. And I think it's like a part of adulting. Like that's when you realize you're like an adult, like when you have to start dealing with these things and learning like, okay, like I have to set boundaries now. But like you said, in the end, it really does bring freedom, and freedom like to also like weed out a lot of things that maybe are not like helpful for you. And like I'm thinking back like to what Lisa said here in friendships, like for me, like I've had an experience where if I'm giving out like level 10 access to somebody and they're like not meeting that, then I know that I need to lower my level of access. And I know that I have good intentions for that person and I wish them the best, but like you're not going to get that same level of me in our friendship or whatever, any type of relationship. And I think it just frees you up to be able to do more and to like better yourself. And like you said, it's the best form of self-care.
Yeah.
So
I also thought, I mean, I'm sure other people have dealt with this, but like making the same mistakes over and over, especially with relationships.
yeah, that's
So for me, or like other people, they're like, oh, how come I go for the same type of guy and then I end up getting my heart broken? Or how come I'm always in the same situation, like different person, same situation.
yeah.
And then it happens a few times and you realize like, okay, I need to put an end to this. I need to figure out why I do this.
Maybe I'm the problem.
Yeah, I mean, there's going to be a problem at the end of the day. And if you realize it doesn't matter really who's around you, it's you, you need to fix it. So I remembered like always asking, and I'm such a logical person. I'm like, I just need an answer and like, I'll just do it. And I was the issue because I didn't have boundaries. Or, okay, I did. Everyone has a boundary. When you feel uncomfortable and you feel like someone's taking advantage and you get like super anxious inside, like clearly your body's saying like, hey, this is not cool. So I had boundaries. I just didn't know how to communicate them. So at the end of the day, maybe the guys weren't the best guys, but also when I never said no to them or just let them do whatever, they thought it was okay because I never verbalized like, hey, I don't feel comfortable with this, or like, hey, I don't want to talk about this.
Yeah.
So again, I can't really say that they were the issue. It was kind of me not verbalizing it. And now looking back, I'm like, man, I wish I just said something.
Yeah.
And it's like no one teaches you, especially when you're like a younger girl, to even have a voice. And then if you're with the guy you like, you don't want to like feel rejected, or you want to like still feel included, but it's like, no, you want to be with someone who respects the boundaries.
Yeah.
And then I grew up a little, and then I met James, and I remember I'm like, let me set boundaries. Like, what does that look like? And I started setting boundaries, and then when we would hit them, he would respect it. I was like, wow, like they work if they're respectful people, obviously. So that was like a really cool thing to see, where it's like, okay, I have to set them, and if someone respects it, this is a person you want to keep in your life. And like you said, even with friendships, if someone doesn't really see the same like eye to eye on you, you can still love them as a person and like have them around, but they don't have access to that anymore. And maybe someone else will come around that is like you, and then you have more like space for them too.
Yeah.
So,
oh my gosh.
I know we talked about when being young, you like wanted all the friends and you just want to have like the cool crowd and you want to know everyone, and you get older and you realize like smaller circle.
Yeah.
Better quality people.
Yeah, it is like that. And oh, what you said was so relatable. Like, especially,
well, I said a lot.
yeah, all of it was relatable, but especially like in relationships. But like, I just kept thinking like, it's easy like when you're younger to, and now looking back, like you said, I wish I would have, but like, don't beat yourself up, because especially not growing up seeing that, like, especially in immigrant communities, it's just true. We don't really have boundaries. Like, there's a lot of enmeshment going on. There's a lot of, like, our parents see us as an extension of themselves. And especially, like, when we become adults, I think maybe all of us have dealt with that when you get married, where, like, one or, like, both of the parents don't respect certain things. And, like, then it can cause issues in your marriage. It's just true. And then you have to think and like communicate that like with your parents, and that can be like really awkward because they see that as rejection if you're setting up a boundary. But like even me, for example, like with my mom, I'm my mom's like only daughter, so that was hard for her. Like when I got married, that like, you know, I love you, Mom, but I'm married now, and like you're not gonna have the same level of access as you did when I was living under your roof. And like if that was like rejection for her, but then like as I sat down, and it's all about communication and like honesty and transparency, and like I told her like, Mom, I love you, I want us to have like a good relationship, this is what I need in order for us to have a good relationship. And like I'm so thankful that she respects, you know, my boundaries, and especially as a mother now and as a parent, she respects me so much in my decisions. But it's all about honesty, communication, and the intent you have, like like before setting those boundaries with that person. So
because it's hard for people to understand them. Again, sometimes you need to explain it to people, and if they still don't understand, then that's when you just cut them off. So I think family is funny because, especially the immigrant community, like you're not your individual self. You're as a whole. Even when you get married, I think there's a line where you need to realize like your spouse comes first and then your family. And it's hard because your whole life it's like, okay, your family and your parents. So when you get married, I think it's also transition. I'm sure when our kids get married, it's going to be hard to like fully let them go and be like, I still love you. But you're married now. So it's a learning curve for everyone. But it all comes down to like communicating it, respecting it, and then once you communicate it and someone doesn't respect it, then you know. And it makes life easier instead of keeping them around and always having issues with them.
Absolutely.
So it can be hard to understand the importance of boundaries and begin setting them in place, but by setting boundaries, we protect ourselves and our relationships. Only then we can experience true freedom and get out from underneath the weight of guilt that may be holding us down in order for us to reach our full potential.
Perfectly said. You wrapped it up perfectly with that. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. Today's episode was really just helpful and eye-opening to Adriana and I. We hope it was to you guys too. We would really appreciate feedback. You can go ahead and leave feedback of any episodes on our Facebook group or in our anonymous suggestion box, which is in our link tree in our Instagram bio. Subscribe to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube so that you can keep up with new episodes. And please join us again next week for another episode.